Okay. Hello and welcome. This is our next iteration of the virtual conversations that we've been having at the Sharmeen and Bijan Mossavar Rahmani Center for Iran and Persian Gulf Studies at Princeton. My name is Amy Malik. I'm an associate research scholar at the center, and it is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Farzaneh Hemassi, who will be speaking to us today about her new book, which is a fantastic piece of ethnography, ethnomusicology, history, so many wonderful things going into this text. So I'm really looking forward to hearing from Dr. Hemassi. First, I want to quickly introduce her, give a sense of her bio. She's an associate professor of ethnomusicology at University of Toronto, and her book that she's going to talk to us today about is Tehrangeles Dreaming, Intimacy and Imagination in Southern California's Iranian Pop Music, and that came out just a couple weeks ago, I guess, from Duke University Press. So we're really excited about that. Her interests concern popular music, celebrity, transnational media publics, the politics of popular culture, and music in urban environments. Her area of expertise, obviously, is Iranian popular music, as well as transnationality, media, and politics. And her previous publications have appeared in Journal of Middle East Women's Studies, Popular Music, Popular Communication, Ethnomusicology, and Mehor Music Quarterly. And those publications cover topics like the post-revolutionary political metaphorization of the Iranian female singing voice, Iranian 20th century new poetry and popular music, and the Iranian expatriate cultural industries in Southern California. Professor Hemassi received her doctorate with distinction from Columbia University, and she's held multiple fellowships, including at the University of Pennsylvania's Penn Humanities Forum and Columbia University's Middle East Institute and its Institute of Social and Economic Policy and Research. She has a number of accolades here. I'm going to let you go to her fantastic website that she has developed so you can see her entire CV. And let's just cut to the chase. I'd love to start to hear from Dr. Hemassi. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you very much, Dr. Malik, for having me. It's a real pleasure to get to present about this recent book, which has been with me for a long time, and especially to do it with you because you are a diaspora scholar and somebody whose work I've admired for a while. So I'm glad to be able to talk to you about it.
I'm so excited. Thank you so much for agreeing to speak with us.
Oh, my pleasure. So what I'm going to do today is walk you through a slideshow of the that takes us through some of the themes of the book, and I'll keep this rather free form and try to keep the reading to a minimum. If we were in person, maybe I would show you a lot more video, but since we're on the internet together and things can get a little slow, we'll rely mostly on visual images, and sometimes we'll go to music to talk about, to get some real examples. I will mention that there's a playlist that goes along with the book that's available on YouTube, so you can look at that later and kind of get a sense of the sights and sounds of Iranian Los Angeles that I talk about in the book. There are many others. It's a fraction of what's available out there, and a fraction of what many people already are aware of and may be dear to people's hearts. So I want to emphasize that the book is it's an ethnography and it's a history of Tehrangeles popular music from my perspective and from the perspective of the research that I've done there. It doesn't aim towards comprehensiveness. It aims towards particularity. So which means that I've spoken with particular people and taken their viewpoints to craft a narrative of its relatively brief, almost exactly 40-year history. So I'm going to switch to sharing a PowerPoint with you, and we will get this going. All right. Okay, so you know who I am, and you know where we are, and you know what the book is called, and I will just go forward. So I imagine that many people who are going to be watching this are familiar with Tehrangeles pop. In case you are not, Tehrangeles pop is the term that I'm using for what is variously called Musiqi Pop Los Angeles, or pop or Los Angelesi. What it refers to is the popular music that's produced in Los Angeles or in the Los Angeles area dating from right around 1978 into the present. It's a popular music and media industry that is born of the revolution. It's born really of people fleeing the revolution or who happened to be in the United States at the time of the revolution, who then felt uncomfortable returning back to Iran thereafter. The industry has its roots specifically in two places. One is in the pre-revolutionary, really highly developed popular music industry within territorial Iran. And you know, an industry that had ties to film and to cinema, to television, that was involved in Tehran and other large cities, booming cabaret scenes and live performance venues. That was then effectively shut down during the period of the revolution because music came under attack during the period of Islamification and Islamicization and purification of Iran during the production of what is now called the Islamic Republic. So 40 years ago, precisely in 1980, we have the beginning of the Islamic Republic and effectively the shuttering of this vast popular music industry that had existed prior to that. So some of the images that you're seeing in this picture date from the early part of from the 1980s, some are from the 1990s, and some are from the 2000s. And some were initially issued as CDs, others as cassettes. And in the case of Saucy, who is a relatively new transplant to Los Angeles, we have something that's very recent. This is a song that was a hit in 2019. But we have, in almost every case, I'm looking at these images to make sure that I'm correct. Yes, in every case, in the images of the artists that you're seeing here, first generation migrants. So people who moved to the United States and specifically to Southern California, either right away after leaving Iran or relatively later afterwards. They moved as adults. Their adult life has been spent in Iran, and then they moved. So I want to make that clear because the book is really focused on the experience of that first generation of migrants. It's not on second generation, which is totally interesting, but just not what I'm talking about here. I'm really focused on the generation of people who, in some cases, as with somebody like Gugush, were and Dariush, and arguably some of the others here too, Vigen for sure, were pioneers in the creation of popular music for entire generations in the 1960s, 70s, and in Vigen's case in the 50s, and who then had to restart their careers completely after the revolution in a very different circumstance. Now, each of these artists has a little bit of a different trajectory leading them to Southern California, but they are the ones who, in a sense, experienced the heights of pre-revolutionary achievement in terms of popular culture, and then had to reorient themselves to a completely different setting as exiles, as expatriates, where they had to sing for their supper in a way that they hadn't perhaps in the same ways prior to the revolution. I might pause on that one for a bit because the economic piece is really important and interesting, but I think we should come back there. So just to get back to thinking about what kind of music we're talking about, when people think about Tehrangeles pop, they often think about dance music. And many of the artists that are portrayed on this screen do in fact perform dance music. Andy and Kuros, Farmaz Asif, not only dance music, but certainly Jalal Hemati, my favorite and yours to dance to at parties. Saucy is a dance music artist, but there are also a lot of artists who perform serious, politically inflected, romantic, morose ballads. So the whole spectrum of emotional and affective performances on display and available through Los Angeles. But because of the industry's history, dance music has become really important. So I'll get back to that in a second. So Many of you either have been to Iranian Los Angeles or have a sense of its sense of what it's like there. These images are collected from my fieldwork when I was in Los Angeles, starting in 2007, and then pretty much every year since then until 2018 or so. I think I stopped contributing new information to the book. So for most people, the center of Iranian Los Angeles geographically is Westwood, which is near UCLA. It's on the west side of Los Angeles. And this is where you see the Persian Square sign down at the bottom of the screen there. Recently, they put this sign up. Well, relatively recently to me. But for instance, I, as a kid, and many other people who grew up in the United States or in California, would visit this part of Los Angeles to go buy groceries, to go buy books in Persian, buy Persian music, and really just to see other Iranians. So this was a place where you could go and see Iranians on the street. I grew up in Northern California, so not anywhere near some place that had such a high concentration. So it's a known place to many people. But Iranian Los Angeles as media travels much farther than that. We'll get to the sort of deterritorialization of Iranian Los Angeles in a second. But what I want to show you first is this image of Vigen, who is an artist we just talked about a minute ago, Vigen Derderian, who is an example of somebody who is this pioneering generation of Iranian musician, who started his career in Iran in the 1950s, and then moved to Los Angeles, where he continued to be an entertainer and is now buried in the Los Angeles area. There's a photograph of his grave in Thousand Oaks, California. And you can see he has written on his tombstone that he's the king of pop music of Iran. One of the interesting things about the Los Angeles Iranian population of this particular generation is that it has the reputation for keeping the flame of the Pahlavi era alive. We saw that in our previous image. I have this monarchist display that was at a Sizdeh Bedar festival in celebration associated with the Iranian New Year in Balboa Park in the San Fernando Valley. And it's really common to see images of the Shah, of the Shah's son, and of other political opposition groups that are not associated with the Islamic Republic, but especially of high concentration, visible concentration of monarchists. This idea that prior political generation or political orientation is an important part of Southern California's distinctive Iranian culture. It doesn't define it entirely, certainly, but it is important. There's this sense in which Pahlavi Iran lives and dies in Los Angeles, so that there are physical remnants of the Pahlavi era that have actually been interred into the ground, so that the landscape has truly changed as a result. And Vigen's prominent grave, it's quite a large grave, stone for him, is just one of several in his particular grave site, but also in Los Angeles in general, so that Iranians in Los Angeles have made their mark physically on the landscape. This is something that Neda Maqbooleh talks about in her book on chapter on Persian palaces in the sort of mansions in Beverly Hills. It's also something we can see more recently with Tehrangeles pop star Andy's new Hollywood star that he had put on in the Hollywood neighborhood. So I was glad to see him recognized for his achievements. Speaking of Andy, this transnationality, we're talking about music that's very much pop music that's associated with Los Angeles, but what's really critical to my treatment of it and to the music in general is that it has a truly transnational reach in several ways, primarily through media, which is the way that I and most people access all kinds of music, but also through touring. So these are some posters for Andy, who is one of our most popular entertainers, performers. And you can see that he is performing in Denver. In the Persian script poster over here, he's on the far left, he's performing in Georgia, in Gurjistan. Then he's in Turkey, and then he's at some random Iranian wedding. So don't know who that is, but I'll tell you, I found that one on the internet as part of his promotional self-promotion. So this music that's geographically focused in a particular important node in diaspora is dependent on the entire diaspora for its livelihood. So especially for what we might call successful working musicians who can draw audiences elsewhere. But media is really crucial to that. But before we get there, I'll note that Turkey and Gurjistan, Georgia, are very close to territorial Iran. They're right outside the borders, but they aren't in Iran. So we won't see concerts by any of these artists for the time being, or for the past 40 years within Iran, because they aren't allowed to return there for the time being, or they feel that they will be unwelcome. There are rumors that certain musicians return to Iran regularly, but or have returned to Iran, some with issue, some without issue. But for the most part, this is an industry that and population that has relied on media and appearances outside of the country in order to sustain themselves. This media is really varied, and some of it can be called commercial or private, and some of it is state-run by, for instance, the United States government, for VOA and for Radio Farda, for BBC Persian, and for Iran International, most recently by Saudi Arabia. We have a variety of people and actors, parties that include pop from Los Angeles and music from many other places, not just pop from Los Angeles, but Los Angeles pop musicians feature prominently in many of these outlets, who are their music is being circulated to Iranian audiences, Persian-speaking audiences worldwide via satellite television, via the internet. Both satellite television has historically been more important. So one of the things that I try to understand in the book is how the way that something circulates, the way that a certain kind of music or media circulates impacts how it is then received, so that it's not merely content, even though content is important. It's not even necessarily the artist or the producers of the music's intentions, but sometimes the mere medium itself can be what impacts how music or message or medium is received. So for instance, once an artist appearing on Manoto is an important way to gain international audiences, whether you're appearing on a television special, or you're having your music video shown, or you are Gugush and you have your program, Gugush Music Academy from a few years ago on the television show. From an Iranian government sort of conservative point of view, being a part of the Manoto television network is akin to being a soldier in the soft war against the Iranian government and the Iranian people. It's a part of the cultural attack, and to use the old terminology, or the soft war to use newer terminology. So one of the, to me, most bedeviling things about Tehrangeles pop is how it manages to be at once so lighthearted in many cases, right? So focused on fun and for dance parties and just good time party music, and at the same time gets enmeshed in very complicated international conflicts that are at very high stakes, and in which a lot of power and a lot of money is invested. So you know, for those of us who grew up in diaspora or even in Iran, and who are familiar with, for instance, Tapesh TV, or I'm thinking of the Tanin specials, the Tanin video specials that were like pretty low budget, filmed in somebody's sound studio. Khordadyan was dancing on stage, you know, there's a band in the background. Sometimes my memory and many other people's memories of Tehrangeles pop from the 80s and 90s is this kind of almost home video quality to it. Things really kind of scrappy, you know, people were doing amazing things in their studios, especially when they had just come from Iran and were trying to restart their careers in exile and make a living and all the rest of the things they were doing. But, you know, once we hit the 2000s, we start seeing, and once satellite television really picks up, and stations in Los Angeles start getting on, Iranian stations in Los Angeles start getting involved in satellite distribution and broadcast, we see a lot more money pouring into the production of really high quality Persian language media that is supposed to win hearts, minds, and pocketbooks, you know. So to me, this is really fascinating, and I could talk about it all the time, but I'll keep going. I'll just keep these slides. You just keep these slides in your memory. Okay, so I think it's time for us to listen to a little bit of music as I talk on and on. I want to play for you a video for what most people agree is the first song recorded by an Iranian expatriate in Los Angeles as part of this Tehrangeles pop. And it's by one of the people that we consider one of the founders of Iranian pop in Los Angeles, Shahram Shabpare. So this is his song Diyar, and I'm going to attempt to switch to another screen. Let's see how that works. And we'll watch a little bit of this and then we'll talk about it. So there are several videos for this, this song, one of which I had never seen. Amy just told me about it. I'm excited to see it. This is for the folk version of Diyar, and it's not exactly what's on the album. So there's a disco version. This is the folk version.
نگارم می‌رود سرخی رخسارم از دنبال یارم می‌رود من گرفتارم به طوفان در دل دریای عشق یار من با کشتی نو از کنارم می‌رود وای که چه حالی دارم هوای دیار رو دارم تو این دیار غربت فقط خدا رو دارم ای وای که چه حالی دارم هوای دیار رو دارم تو این دیار غربت فقط خدا رو دارم آخه من به کی بگم از این قلب شکستم.
It really pains me to stop Mr. Shabpare in the middle of him singing, but I want to draw people's attention to something as we're listening. So this is a really interesting song. It's something I talk about at some length in the book, not tremendous length, but you know, some length. I am an ethnomusicologist, which means that part of what we do and what I do is analyze music from a sonic perspective. What you'll notice as we listen to this next section is that the song is divided really into two types of sections. It's the verse and the chorus, but also stylistically, the verse is sort of Latin disco, and the chorus switches to what registers with many listeners as a traditional Iranian rhythm or groove or beat. So you'll hear this as we go. So we'll start with the disco and then we'll go to our Damboli Dimbol.
دیگه من با این صدای خستم دل من پر میکشه به اون دیار و شهرم چه کنم عاشقم و عهدم و اونجا بستم وای که چه حالی دارم هوای دیار رو دارم تو این دیار غربت فقط خدا رو دارم ای وای که چه حالی دارم هوای دیار رو دارم تو این دیار غربت فقط خدا رو دارم.
Okay, so what we have there is that straight, pretty much straight Latin disco, dun, dun, go, dun, go, dun, go, dun, go, dun, go, and then we go, "Oi, get your holy door, dun, 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 dun." So this switch back and forth is really interesting. And it happens during the part of the song where Shabbat is singing about the homeland. This rhythm, which is the groove, which we sometimes Iranians call it by lots of different names, but one is shishohash, another one is dambuli, and in English you might say it's 6 and 8, which isn't totally accurate to say that it's a 6/8 rhythm, but that is how a lot of people discuss it. It has a really long history in Iranian popular and art music, and in Los Angeles, it becomes one of the trademark sounds. This isn't really surprising given how important the rhythm is to a variety of what we call mardomi musics, so musics that are popular and populist. So we might think of ruhozi or mochremi or other kinds of performance genres that we have documented back to the 1900s and somewhat earlier, that are danceable and that are associated with happiness, silliness, and a degree of eroticism. What is interesting and unusual at this point for Shab Pariz's song is that he's singing about dancing in the most terrible of times. When he's separated from Iran, when he can't go back, and he's talking about his heart, weeping tears of blood and this kind of thing, as he's, making a soundtrack for people to listen to at parties or at weddings and so on. And one of the things that that was the most fun to write about in the book, and also for me one of the most interesting, was to think about how dancing and sadness and happiness are all mixed together for Iranian diaspora, and how important dance music was to the livelihoods of so many musicians working in LA, because they needed to be able to get gigs, basically. And to get a gig, you need to be able to play music that people want to hear at a wedding or a party. That's when people are hiring musicians. But then how that got layered onto the stereotype that is associated with Los Angeles of being alaki khosh, that they're happy for no reason, or that they're not serious, or that people are trivial, or stereotypes that are not that different from what we might have for Hollywood people. If we were thinking in US terms, that people are concerned with their appearance, or they're concerned with, they're superficial in some way. These are the traveling stereotypes. But for Los Angeles, I talk about how these ideas also get mapped onto a certain musical sound as well, so that to be called shishohashti, for instance, could be an insult. That if you are shishohashti, then that means that you are trivial in some way. So that link between musical sound and idea and history and feeling and the social are some of the things that I really enjoy thinking about and talking about in the book. So. Amy, I have so much more. I'm gonna go forward and just see a little bit what else I have here. Yeah. Do you want to interrupt me, or should I just keep on going?
I mean, I'm enjoying it. So, I would say keep on going, and maybe like another 5-6 minutes, and then we can maybe break into conversation. And I'm sure as we speak, there will be more things that, you'll want to draw on from this.
Sure, sounds good. Okay, great. Yes, okay, so here we were with Shab Pareh. Right, so one thing that I didn't mention about the Shishohasht rhythm is that it appears in Los Angeles along with tons of performers who end up playing it and making it the cornerstone of their musical repertoire at the moment when it is effectively banned within territorial Iran. You know, during the revolution, popular music and many forms of art music were shut down. And I realize I'm showing you this tantalizing Gugush slide, so I'm going to switch it back. I can't read that. So Los Angeles was able to supply something that wasn't available domestically, but which was Iranian, very, very Iranian. In fact, for some people becomes, you know, one of the hallmarks of being Iranian is being able to dance to this kind of music and to dance in a particular way to this kind of music. So you have this situation where something that belonged in Iran was cast out of the country or suppressed within the country because within the revolutionary reordering of culture and politics, it became inappropriate or newly inappropriate. It had always been inappropriate for some people. And it appeared in Los Angeles as something that the diaspora could offer to, or this corner of the diaspora could offer to the rest of the Iranian world. And Afghans, by the way, and Tajiks, right? So it's just Persian speakers and people who are relating to this style of music. So another thing that is really important in Los Angeles, that Los Angeles can offer is access to women, is access to uncovered female bodies, Iranian female bodies, and women's voices. So women's singing voices. You know, many areas of Iranian music have freed up since the revolution gradually and quite dramatically, to the point that a song full of shishohasht and for dancing and so on could be produced in Iran very easily and is produced in Iran and is approved of by government and so on. The style is not so important. What is important and where the red line still seems to be is around female performers. And this has to do with the perceived immorality and immodesty of women presenting themselves for general consumption, to a public audience, so that to the extent that women, for the time being, are still not recording in Iran because their voices can be heard by men to whom they are not closely related. So I'll skip ahead 2 slides and say that a video, like a very typical Andy video, is full of women, absolutely chock full of them. And that this is, in addition to the sound, the sight of what he's providing is also really important. It's part of what helps the music catch attention. And I think, you know, when we're talking about music, I do think it's important that this book is about music, not just because I'm an ethnomusicologist, but because music was so heavily restricted after the revolution, and also because music has particular kinds of affordances that I'm happy to talk about later. But also music is visual as well as sonic, right? So I'm pretty invested in talking about the visual aspects of this and the media circulation aspects of all of this as well. So women as props is a really important aspect of Tehrangelis pop. And I'm sure if you're familiar at all with the genre, you can think of many similar videos where there are just, you know, tons of women everywhere in the background. But women are also in the foreground as performers. And there's nobody more in the foreground than Gugush. So I wanted to bring up an area where another aspect of this transnational connection, to think about controversy as transnational controversy surrounding popular performers in diaspora. And in this case, with Gugush, I have a March 2017 announcement by a revolutionary court in Tehran, which is certainly symbolic, not intended to, you know, they're not, no, but I don't think anybody's intending to go pick her up. But she was sentenced in absentia to 16 years in prison for propaganda against the Islamic Republic, creating centers of corruption and corrupting the public. This kind of, you know, during the revolution period, the Revolutionary Court had quite a bit of power. I mean, and it still does, but these were the bodies that had arrested Gugush initially, or had asked for her to come and speak in the courts, and initially her and a lot of other singers about their crimes, the crime of being a singer during that period. So the language of fesad, of corruption, being used against her from a distance of half a world away, that she's corrupting via videotape or via satellite feed, is a statement to me about how questions about morality and national boundaries and the Iranian state's ability to monitor and control its own citizens' media intake gets intertwined with questions and issues of commerce and of sexuality and of media circulation in some really interesting ways, so that Tehran and Tehrangeles are quite intertwined. They almost need each other, you know, in order to retain a kind of enemy. Now, some of this is, well, we'll get to that later. Okay. Okay, so just so you have a sense of what the book's about, I'm going to just tell you briefly what the chapters are about, and then I'll stop talking. So this first chapter is about Shishohasht, and it's called The Capital of Shishohasht, and it is about the phenomenon of dancing and dance music, and why and how it became so prominent in Southern California. So I have interviews with, I guess the longest interview in that section is with Shahbal Shabpare, who is Shahram Shabpare's brother. He's not as well known as his brother Shahram, but Shahbal Shabpare is a really important figure in Southern California, and also in pre-revolutionary Iran, as the first as part of the Rebels, which was a group prior to the Black Cats, and then the Black Cats, which he started again in exile. So I talk about the rhythm itself. I talk about a phenomenon of cultural intimacy, which is a concept developed by Michael Hertzfeld, an anthropologist who I believe is at Harvard University. It's this feeling of cultural intimacy, refers to this feeling of rueful self-recognition that we feel when we encounter something that reminds us of who we are, but that we simultaneously can feel ashamed of. And I talk a lot about and look through some interviews and quotes from people about how they simultaneously love Shishohasht and hate Shishohasht and are embarrassed by it and don't want anything to do with it, but then crave it, or musicians feeling that they're forced to deliver this to their audiences because it's what their audiences want and are willing to pay for. This then leads to questions about what's valuable, what do we value, and why might we not value this part of our musical and cultural heritage. The next chapter gets into history as well, and here I look into the careers of 4 different men. One is Manucher Bibian. He's a picture of him and me at his house that appears on his website. And he's the founder of Apollon Records in pre-revolutionary Iran, claims to be one of the most prolific producer of pre-revolutionary popular music. Extremely knowledgeable about popular music, and has an archive of his own in his home, and an archive that he's produced on his own website. Once he came to Los Angeles, he started Jam Jam television station, which was the first cable television station here in Los Angeles. And he has shuttered the station now some time ago, but he is very invested in setting the record straight about his legacy as a popular music producer and about what he and his cohort of pioneers in Persian pop were able to achieve prior to the revolution, and then what they tried to achieve and maintain and preserve once they left the country. I talk a bit about Shahram Shahpareh as architect of Iranian Los Angeles in this terms of its popular music. And then I also speak with Vartan Avanesian and Jahangir Tabarai, who are at Taraneh Enterprises, the really prolific popular music label in Los Angeles, which is still open, and how they're managing their transition into a almost a post-music industry period. The music industry doesn't exist the same way as for anybody as it did in the 90s, regardless of who your audience is or what you're producing. But these are really fascinating conversations with people who are foundational to pre-revolutionary popular music and post-revolutionary popular music, grappling with what their legacy will be. I talk about the urgency of that question, especially in a revolutionary context where the emphasis in revolutions is wiping the slate clean, right? Proclaiming everything before as bad and everything that comes after as good. That's been very difficult, obviously, for people who see themselves to have contributed something tremendous to their country's culture and history. At the same time, there's a lot of ambivalence about what Iranian musicians have been able to achieve in diaspora, because their conditions haven't been as good as they were, even though they're not bad. And for many people, they haven't been as privileged as they were for some of the really well-placed celebrities or people who had lots of connections to the government as they were in pre-revolutionary Iran. So thinking about legacy, what's valuable, what's worth preserving, what is preserved, how they will be remembered are all things I cover in this second chapter. The third chapter, I think it's the third, let me look. Let me double check my own book to see. Yes, it's called Expatriate Erotics and Homeland Moralities. And here I'm dealing with a couple of different cases. I'm thinking about desire for the homeland and about desirability of musicians and entertainers in Los Angeles. It's part of, I have two basic case studies, or I guess themes, subjects in this chapter. One is a group of non-heteronormative male performers, one of them fictional and two of them real. Max is the fictional character from the 2005 Iran-based parody of Iranian diaspora singer going back to Iran and getting into all kinds of trouble. The other is Mohammad Khordadyan, who's the famous dancer who's in the lower left there. Jalal Hemmati comes in and out of this chapter because he is Max's idol. Max loves Jalal Hemmati, and many other people love Jalal Hemmati, but also love to hate Jalal Hemmati. And part of this has to do with, I think, homophobia and discomfort with his self-presentation. So in this chapter, I'm thinking about the sort of buried histories of Iran's non-exclusively binary sexuality, and how this appears and reappears in our popular culture in Los Angeles, which can be unsettling, but is also, for some people, but is also the source of a lot of excitement and titillation and humor, some of it homophobic and some of it more celebratory. In this chapter, I'm also thinking about Shahrzad Sepanloo, and I have some sections of interviews I conducted with her in 2007 in an earlier phase, much earlier phase of her career. She was thinking about how to navigate the pressures on a woman who, on herself, wanting to participate as a musician in Los Angeles, but not wanting to be immoral and immodest in the eyes of either her immediate community members or audiences in Iran, which is a very tall order and very difficult. So I talk about And she tells me all about the challenges of figuring out how to be a singer who presents herself in a way that feels right, at the same time trying to communicate and really physically appear on screen. You know, a lot of our conversations are about physical appearance, how to appear on screen in ways that speak to her her desire to be desired by audiences, right? Not in a sexual way, but her desire to appeal to audiences, and that also uphold what she considers to be her standards for appropriate self-conduct. So there's a lot of going back and forth between Iran and Los Angeles in diaspora and in imagination through this particular chapter, both the imaginary of Max as somebody who's a complete fantasy, but is so similar to so many characters in Los Angeles that some people actually thought that, you know, Shahbaz Shahpare had played in the movie. And then other types of fantasies, like the fantasy of returning to Iran via video, the way that Amy's backdrop is allowing her to do right now, right? Her appearing in Tehran via green screen, which is what so many Iranians in Los Angeles do all the time. You know, that's nothing about you, Amy. I know that's just about I am unfortunately in my living room or wherever in Toronto. Okay. Yeah, so I just wanted to include this one image of the stereotype of Los Angeles singers because, you know, this is a very unappealing, unattractive, really insulting portrayal of Iranian singers in Los Angeles, but it does represent the way that some people in diaspora feel about Los Angeles singers. So it says "Khonande Los Angelesi, yalla hame ba ham das das das." You know, he's pretending to, you know, this little squat guy with these two beautiful women next to him, and so these are the kinds of stereotypes that people really want to avoid, and that they sometimes end up playing into at the same time. The last two chapters focus, shift to individual celebrities. And these chapters also represent a switch from music that is, can be seen as apolitical, so dance pop, pre-revolutionary popular music, and as we sort of edge towards politics, more politics, qua politics, easily recognizable politics. So I'm looking at Gugush's post-migration career, the way that she takes up the victimized voice of the nation as a female singer, somebody who is speaking on behalf of Iran sometimes in her songs. And I look specifically at examples where she does that. There's a lot of post-migration music that doesn't do that, but I'm interested in the moments in which she adopts the role of singing for the motherland, or even singing as the motherland. And ways in which she tries to embody the nation in a specifically female form. So I am interested here in the metaphorization, the political metaphorization of the female singing voice, and tropes of silence and sounding, and having a voice in the political agentive sense of the word, and also how that kind of becomes a hallmark for her. I don't want to say a brand, but a trope that she returns to again and again in various guises. So this does a lot of work for her. It does a lot of work for a lot of Iranians in diaspora, the idea of how women and women's unequal rights in the country, and their metaphorically limited abilities to express themselves publicly, supposedly, come together. And it's interesting to explore them through this really exceptional person who is obviously is the biggest star that we have in our community. The final chapter turns to Dariush and becomes very serious. So we've had several chapters of excitement and light and so on, and then we're going very dark with Dariush. So this last chapter is called A Nation in Recovery, and I'm looking at Dariush from the perspective of his personal transformation from somebody who was actively and very publicly suffering with addiction to someone who decided, who entered recovery and then began using his incredible fame and facility with media and his connections to various types of media makers to create platforms for transformation and addiction recovery within Iran and within diaspora. So I am really looking at him from a couple of perspectives. One is him as from his own sort of affective transformation from somebody, the Sultan of Sadness, Sultan Gham, which, you know, is, I sometimes see him referred to as, to somebody who is the voice of hope or the exemplar of what can happen if you enter recovery and you turn your life around. I also look at his activism and his sort of patriotic, rousing songs that have made impacts in Iran, like Dobare Mi Sazam Et Vatan, or some of his media, especially associated with his Ayane Foundation, which is his humanitarian efforts, and think about how his music and his humanitarian action resemble one another, and how he also has really embraced politics rather than, say, doing the kind of move you sometimes see with other musicians, which is, you know, I'm not political, I'm just a singer. He says, I'm political, I am a singer, and goes with it completely. So the book, oops, we don't want to go there. Okay, the book pretty much ends thinking about this as an account of a 40-year history of Iranian popular music in Los Angeles and wondering what will be next. As I said in the beginning, this is really, I consider this really particular to the post-revolutionary moment and of the moment in media capability. It's a music industry that has relied, whose distribution and ability to have the kind of impact it has, that has relied on the kinds of media technologies that have been available. So cassettes initially that were smuggled in, video cassettes that were could be copied hand to hand, CDs which couldn't initially be copied hand to hand, which accounted for a really successful period in Tehrangelis popular music producers because they had a monopoly on their own production, which is really important for them to be able to have that and actually make money from sales, to moving to more music video and internet and satellite television based circulation and production, to the current where you can really produce almost anything at home. You know, the question of the future of a music industry at all versus and also a music industry attached to this generation in this post-revolutionary moment is something that I have a lot of questions about. At the same time, because the situation for musicians continues, and the situation for many people in Iran continues to be very difficult, the phenomenon of the expatriate musician in Los Angeles is it's a renewable resource. You know, there's always new musicians who are deciding to leave Iran and arriving somewhere in diaspora who have something to say and a real desire to say it. And so we'll just have to see what happens.
Indeed, indeed. Okay, let's see if I can get back to there we are. Okay. Thank you so much for that introduction to the text and to the people and places that you've been studying for so long. So I guess I just have a couple of questions that is more just like, please elaborate, because, you know, I've had the privilege of reading the book already, but I know a lot of in our audience won't have yet. You touched on already some of the things that I was hoping to kind of dive into, one of which is this idea of cultural intimacy, this idea of a rueful self-recognition, almost an embarrassment about a cultural feature, which at the same time, you're also kind of drawn to and maybe even secretly love, but there's some tension there. And you use this concept very well to think about Shisho Hasht and how we think of certain kinds of LA pop music. I'm wondering if you can kind of elaborate for us how you see that fitting into this idea of dreaming, because we've been talking about fantasy. You mentioned things about imaginaries and imagining what Iran is like if you haven't been there in the last 40 years. And especially since it's part of the title of the book, I thought it might be a nice thing to elaborate on a little bit.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. I can go a couple of different directions with this, so I'll think about where to go. You know, one of the things that drew me to writing about this in the first place was the experience of traveling to Iran as a young adult for the first time since I left when I was really little, and going to parties or just hanging out at relatives' house in Tehran or in Kashan, where my dad's family's from, and somebody putting on a song, and somebody saying "Farzaneh bayad beraqse," and me saying, "Oh boy," and having to go out and do something, dance in front of a bunch of people I had just met for the first time in 20
Maybe
years.
we should explain in case there's any non-Persian
Oh yeah,
speakers.
right. It means you Farzaneh has to dance.
Has to.
No,
That's it.
no way of saying no. I mean, you can, and maybe you should, but initially at least,
Right, you tar off at first, and
yeah, right, and then
jump in.
just go. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, and thinking, I haven't been here in 20 years, and my relatives haven't been to the United States, and yet we are sharing we know the same songs because the same music I've been listening to at my dad's house is what you've been listening to in Tehran because of media circulation. We're in a private space. We're in the intimate space of the home. We're dancing, we're moving our bodies together in the same space. We're using similar motions. They might not be the same, but if we had been watching Khordadyan, which a lot of people were, in the 90s, then we might have actually been doing some of the exact same movements, even the same routines. I think and we weren't supposed to be having those same experiences because that music was not supposed to be in Iran. Of course, it's the open secret. Everybody knows it's there. There's no real problem with it being there. There's lots of other bigger problems in Iran than unregulated music circulation that the government is concerned with. So, and regular people are concerned with. So I don't want to emphasize the sort of clandestine nature of this. At the same time, it is clandestine. It's a kind of shared participation in a transnational musical culture that is sort of above and beyond law, and is above and beyond borders, and is above and beyond even discourse. We didn't have to talk about it. In fact, that first time I went back to Iran, I could hardly understand a word anybody was saying, but I knew I sort of knew what to do on the dance floor. I won't claim expertise, but so the idea of cultural intimacy, as Herzfeld uses it, and I think this really does apply here, actually has a lot to do with modernity, which may seem like a little bit of a left turn as where we're just talking about. But the musical material that I'm calling culturally intimate for us, for Iranians in diaspora, and to a certain extent, for some Iranians in Iran too, is the stuff of that mochrebi root of it is so popular entertainer, lower class popular entertainer who very often wasn't Muslim, was Jewish, or and because Muslims didn't want to be associated with that kind of music, not always the case, but sometimes the case, that mochrebi rooted music was banned from pre-revolutionary radio and television because it was considered vulgar. At the same time, it was extremely popular. People would buy the albums. It was in films. It was related to what people would have heard in their if they had heard a Motreb play. There was a way what really became interesting is that while the pre-revolutionary official level of cultural regulation sort of roped off this a certain aspect of our dance music as inappropriate because it was unmodern or vulgar, it also fell into the sights of the revolutionary government as being immoral. So it was vulgar, immoral, unmodern, and really popular. So, that kind of, to me, when you find lots of people who are very uncomfortable with something, it means that something very interesting is happening. It's not, it doesn't say that everybody agrees it's bad, it means that it's actually it's touching on something that is so interesting. So culturally intimate in this sense means that it brings people close together, that there is something that makes us feel like we're part of a group, when you listen to it. It also has ties to the idea of sexual intimacy, the idea that there is something, there's an eroticism to this rhythm in certain contexts. And I think back to, say, scenes from Film Farsi, from the 60s and 70s of dancers in cabarets performing extremely erotic, erotically meant to titillate, that kind of thing. And that can be associated with this as well. And certainly in music videos, we see erotic display along with this kind of dance music as well. So it's all kind of mixed in together. The closeness is really there. And, something that's important for me, it's not important in the original concept of cultural intimacy for Herzfeld, but for me is that it's media enabled. So the intimacy happens because of it's distant intimacy. It's a long distance intimacy. And in that sense, we can ask ourselves if it's imagined because it's long distance, or if it's real nevertheless because it's long distance. I think and especially during these COVID times where we're spending so much time on screens, we're wondering, are you and I having a real conversation, or are we imagining that we're having a conversation?
Right.
I mean, it's like that, but times, many levels. This isn't new, but it's an aspect of that grappling with what media enables us to do and feel, and where the gaps still are,
Absolutely. I mean, one of the points that you made in the text about cultural intimacy that really stood out to me as someone who was born and raised in the diaspora is that actually this kind of cultural intimacy starts well before the revolution, right? These ideas about Shish o Hasht, or, this kind of idea of Motrebi and Mardomi music is not something that starts as a mediated thing in the same way that we end up seeing it now. It's like an interesting shift into diaspora. Like, how does these kinds of ideas come with, and in fact are enhanced by perhaps the long distance kinds of connections that you're talking about. So I love that you kind of draw that out in the book. The other piece there that you talk about is the idea of identity, and that dance and music is integral to Iranian identity, which is something that oftentimes I don't think gets talked about, as who are we as Iranians, but we're dancers and we are singers and we are, in love with our music. So I'm also curious about this idea of the connections between identity and nostalgia as you read them through the music. The cover of your book, first of all, for those of us on diaspora, like immediately this was like nostalgia bomb, in the best way, where we recognize the cassette tape cover. Down to the logo that Duke gives you down here. Can you speak a little bit about how you conceive of this kind of nostalgic aspect to the music in terms of diaspora identity? And then also kind of, how did you get this great cover? Because I
Oh
love
yeah. Oh yeah. So the cover is easy. The cover is, I found a bunch of well, first of all, you know, I have to give props to the designer, who is really
Absolutely.
wonderful. Or Matt Touch is his name, and he's really excellent. But I sent him a bunch of cassette covers, and I said, please make my book look like this. And so he did, and we went back and forth on it a little bit. But the Taronnet ripoff on the Duke University Press was completely them. So he figured that one out. So yeah.
Good work.
Yeah. But it was really important to me that it looked like, that it somehow capture that, because the visual aspects of Tehrangeles are really so special, and I think so evocative for many of us. And you know, the sound for sure, but the visuals just as much. So yeah, so the nostalgia bit, you know, it's funny. It's so, grappling with history is so so integral to every part of, you know, every page of the book, that nostalgia is a really useful term, because first of all, because people use it, and they understand it, but it's also like, it just is the inescapability of history. It feels like it weighs on everyone all the time. This, in a couple of ways. One is the comparison with the past, always. And for this first generation who moved in adulthood from Iran to Los Angeles within the 1970s, late 1970s and 80s, that compare the past is Pahlavi past. It is history is so politicized also. It isn't, so that nostalgia also becomes political. You know, to say that things were better before means that things aren't good now, or that there's a way of that the employing nostalgia is a form of critique. You know, so that it's sort of a resource that can be tapped again and again. Now, one of the great things about trying to do nostalgic production during this particular period in time is that we have media archives that allow us to literally cut the images of the past and sounds of the past into the present and reconfigure them in all kinds of ways. So there are fascinating examples in live performances and in music videos. Live performance is one of the most time-bending ones, of seeing, for instance, Dariush on stage singing next to his old self, you know, and his old self is projected on the screen behind him and is much bigger than the tiny figure who is singing in front of us, you know. Especially strange or kind of jarring in Dariush's case, because recovery is such a big part of his personal narrative. And so you're seeing the recovered Dariush in front of you and the addicted Dariush behind you, you know, bigger. You know, anyway, I often wonder how that is for him personally. But Googoosh does the same thing. Almost all of the singers of that generation do something similar, where they purposefully draw on history. Now, I had a chapter in the book that I didn't end up putting in because I wanted to keep it short and I was getting tired of it. But that bases around conversations that I had with some musicians, or really record sellers, saying that it's always been pre-revolutionary music that sells better than the new stuff, and that even as new stuff comes out, the most reliable sales are of pre-revolutionary material in like nice boxes, you know, with nice case. Yeah, box sets, exactly. Thank you. Thinking about how the past becomes literally valuable, like more valuable financially than the present, is something that I think also speaks to people's ambivalence about what it means to be in diaspora. You know, it's easy to say, yeah, I think that was surprising to me in Los Angeles when doing the research, was finding really how ambivalent people who were within the industry were about what they had achieved, and how to consider themselves, you know, against how they felt about their achievements prior to the revolution.
Mm. There's so much I want to ask you, but just I know we're running short on time. So the last question I want to kind of have us think about is the role of Tehrangeles going forward. So you kind of close the book saying that, you know, Shesh Hasht is no longer necessarily the dominant groove in this in Iranian pop music, nor are, you know, the ways of making music, distributing music, and circulating music the same as they were at the height of Tehrangeles as a kind of center of Iranian pop music. So what do you think that means for Tehrangeles as like a cultural center in the diaspora? Is Tehrangeles still the cultural center? Is it on its way out? What do we think about that?
I think I need some people to go to the UAE and Dubai, and maybe somebody could go to Sweden and and do some.
Maybe
like
somebody should.
Yeah. And Toronto, where I am now, and lots of other places to think about, to Turkey, to, you know, to all over the place. You know, Iranians have traveled so many places since. Los Angeles and Southern California still supposedly has the largest population of Iranians in the world, right? And it's you know, travel ban be damned. They still make it there sometimes. Not to make light of that, by the way.
Not at all.
You know, but to say it's remarkable with all of the political and various economic obstacles and that Iranians have faced trying to migrate anywhere in the world, and especially to the United States, still managed to come, and it's amazing. So, you know, I think, as I've said a couple of times, and I really think is important, that the people don't need to be in a single physical location in the same way to create productions, just the way you and I aren't, right? And that the spreading of people and their ability to continue to collaborate even at a distance means that different kinds of relationships and ways of even considering what cultural production is are changing. So, you know, for the musicians who first landed in Los Angeles, it was like chain migration, not of family, but of professional networks. So that, oh, Shahram is there, so you should come because he can set you up at this club. They can set you up at this club. Yeah, we know these guys here. They'll come to the studio here. Yeah, so and so, you know, Ali Tangri has a studio here. And so those professional networks were extremely important to getting things off the ground. I think professional and personal networks are still really important, but I think a lot also depends on what people are willing to buy, how they're willing to spend money. Are people willing to buy albums anymore? No, so we can't rely on that as a way of making money. Are they willing to go to concerts? Well, they were. We'll see what happens now that we can't really assemble in groups. So there are so many questions now that I don't want to try and predict what's going to happen. I'd rather find out and have somebody else write a book on that. But I am really interested.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think having the history is so important, and that's something you've given us in this book. So thank you for that. And I know there's going to be an army of scholars that's going to come after to try to build on your shoulders. So thank you for that.
Yeah. Thank you very much for having me. I enjoyed speaking with you.
Likewise, I hope that we can direct our listeners to your website and to this playlist that Dr. Hemmassi has put together as a companion to the book, so that as you're reading, you can watch these music videos, hear these songs, and it really adds so much richness to the read. So we'll see if we can embed that link somehow. And if nothing else, at least go find her website and you will definitely see it there.
All right. Thank you very
Thank
much
you
again.
so much.
Yeah, my pleasure.